There we go.
All right. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Heavenly Father, Almighty God, grant us the grace to hope in you with unwavering trust. As we begin this season of Advent, may our hearts be filled with the hope that comes from knowing your promises are true. We pray that there will be a world filled, in today's world that is filled with turmoil. Grant us the tranquility that only your peace can bring. Help us to be instruments of reconciliation and harmony in our relationships and our communities. We ask, Father, your blessings on this meeting tonight, our speakers, our guests, and our brothers. We ask your blessing on our Brotherhood of St. Andrew, that we will continue to do the Great Commission and do the work that you ask us to do. We lift us all in prayer to you, Almighty Father. Amen.
Amen.
Brothers, thank you all and sister, thank you all for being here with us tonight. And I'll now turn it over to Brother Tom Welch, and who's going to introduce our speaker for the night.
All right. Thank you, Brother Conrad, and welcome, brothers and Mom. This is the first in a series. I think of the first time we've had three priests back to back. Next month, just as a reminder, Reverend Scott Gunn, the editor for Forward Movement out of Cincinnati. And then in February will be the executive director and publisher for the Living Church. Tonight, we have with us Dean Ian Markham, the Dean of Virginia Theological Seminary, where, as you all know, I'm full-time student while I'm with you all part-time. Dean Markham is in his 16th year. I have an extraordinary class of students here in my group of about 30 or so. And we've been talking in the last few days here about what a delight and a joy it's been to be here as students. We did not realize, or at least I didn't, the world-class staff that is here by way of faculty and visitors from around the world. You barely go a week without somebody from overseas being here. It's kind of lightened up now that we're past Thanksgiving. And this seminary is at the spot now where it's hailing about 1 in 4 priests in the church today are coming from the ranks of VTS here in Alexandria. So you all have had a chance to read Dean Markham's bio and vita. I'm going to give as much time as we can to him this evening to talk on the subject of men in the church today. As we talked over the last couple of weeks, there are a couple of other topics that we might be involved with Dean Markham later in 2024 as we get our new board seated. Brother Gilberto out of Brooklyn. Hello there, Brother Hines. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the 16th Dean of Virginia Theological Seminary, Ian Markham. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a joy to be with you all. And can I just start by just saying that I'm always impressed that people find time to participate in this sort of learning. And I admire deeply the commitment of the Brotherhood to this sort of continuing education and deep reflection on the problems and challenges facing the church. So thank you for everything you do and what you represent in our church. I do have a PowerPoint, and I've been given the authority to share my screens. Let's see if this works. And with luck, you can see a slide which says, Selling the Church to Men, How Do We Do This? And so this is birthed out of actually engagement. In fact, that might be my first slide with this text. Richard Reeves of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters and What to Do About It. So there is a very lively debate in America today about the challenges facing men. And it is worth just pausing and noting how significant this debate is. We're very accustomed with this sense that women have had to endure patriarchy and disadvantage in all sorts of ways. And that's been a major issue in the 70s and 80s and 90s and into this century as we think a little bit about the vocation of women and the options for women and the fact that they can be both mothers and they can work. ideas that, in the 19th century were considered unthinkable, we now take as normal. And of course, we're all acutely aware that ethnic minorities, persons of color, they often find difficult life challenging because of racism. And that's a real issue that inhibits options for those groups. The one group that we've sort of not, in a way, worried about are males. And yet, the interesting thing is the data is increasingly disturbing about men in general, and men, incidentally, African-American men and Latino men are also disadvantaged as well. And it's at every level. You'll find it in education. The data is carefully and well documented. Girls are 14 percentage points more likely than boys to be school ready at the age of 5. So that means with the capacity and aptitude to handle the curriculum that you expect at 5 years, which is elementary reading and some sort of numbers. Girls are much more likely to be ready for their initial schooling. Girls will graduate from high school with a higher GPA than boys. They're more likely to have taken AP classes. In 2018, 88% of girls graduated high school, while only 82% of boys. There's clear evidence that boys' brains develop more slowly. 50%, almost 60% of bachelor degrees go to women. And now they outperform men at master's level, and there's parity in when it comes to doctorates. So the males are generally underperforming in education, and there's a significant and growing statistical gap. It's interesting. The elite schools could easily be 60-40 when it comes to women over men. There are some which could be 70-30. One little interesting feature, which will, I think, be a challenge for the Supreme Court over the next 50 years, is that there's clear evidence that admissions offices are discriminating in favor of men to try and avoid the student body not being too distorted at elite universities. And they're partly doing that because to attract the most able women, they don't want to go to a school which is 70-30 women, men. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that we're facing. But in education, it's clear men are underperforming. Now, when it comes to employment, now traditionally, employment's been a sort of male domain, and it's been a struggle for women to get into the workforce. Now, male participation in jobs has fallen over the last century from 96% to 89%. And male jobs have been damaged by two key things, really: automation and free trade. Now, there's still a pay gap. So in other words, men get paid more than women, even for the same sort of job. That's a real issue. And there's still a glass ceiling. Women don't necessarily get promoted to the C-suite in companies. But there's greater unemployment amongst men, and we've been deeply damaged by COVID. And women, partly because they're better skilled in terms of education, are finding more advancement. You get increasingly in homes the phenomenon that the wife earns more than the husband, which was not known in much of the 20th century. So it's a real issue in respect to jobs. And then in the family, 40% of births in the United States are outside a marital unit. Okay, now, and that often means you have the phenomenon of the absentee father for a whole host of reasons. So that's a significant and now settled trend. Having a child within marriage is not considered socially a social imperative, and often therefore it doesn't happen. And then you have a whole host of data now about the impact of singleness on men over women. So basically, women are better holding things together than men. And the single male I use the expression is often a mess. That's oversimplifying things a little bit, but on almost all the social indicators, it's clear. Their health is more likely to be poor. They're less likely to be working, and their social networks are weaker. Women, on the other hand, can cope with singleness much better than men can. And of course, if you are unemployed for a significant season, then there's a statistically high likelihood of divorce. So it's a real problem in respect to the family. So you have the phenomenon of absentee partners, you have the problem of men who find themselves without a job. So all these problems interrelate. Education makes it harder for men to get jobs. But if you don't have a job, you're more likely to get divorced. So it ends up being a vicious circle. And then once the male's single, life can be really, really difficult on a whole host of levels in a way that is not for a woman. In fact, interestingly, there's some evidence that for a man to be married, the health effects are considerable. You know, you're looking at potentially an extra decade on your life. For a woman to be married is actually marginal. So it worked. Marriage is a really good thing for men. Women can do without it. That's actually what the data seems to show. Okay, now I alluded right at the beginning, this sort of picture around the male is complicated when it comes to the challenge of racism and also socioeconomic disadvantage. And the problems then become much, much more acute. So, you have a problem in respect to just being male, and then you also have the problem of coping with racism. And then if you're a male who's also poor, then you have additional complexities. And if you are all three, life can be really, really difficult. So that's an important complexity. Socioeconomic factors are major here, and can ameliorate other disadvantages. So even if you're socioeconomically fortunate and African American, you'll be fine. If you're socioeconomically fortunate and male, you can be fine. If you're socioeconomically fortunate and you are single, you can be fine. So the socioeconomic factor is an overlay in all this, which adds to its complexity. So with all this data, what do we need to think a little bit about? Well, there's a huge argument. If you want a little exercise, you can compare Richard Reeves' book, which is published by the Brookings Institute. So it's loosely a left of center text with the text by the Senator Josh Hawley. He's written a book arguing that basically the male's been emasculated by feminism, and America needs a masculine male. It needs, and what's happened is progressive causes have eroded the self-understanding of the male and made it difficult to function effectively. And now we're facing an enormous social crisis, and a social crisis which will get much, much worse. Because you've got to remember the socioeconomic advantage is literally for the top 7%. It's not the middle classes. It's not, it's only those who are very, very rich, where money seems to basically sort out a lot of challenges. For the rest of us, this is a real issue. You'll find, if you think in your orbits of grandchildren and sons perhaps and friends and their children, you'll often find that they'll speak with some pride about the performance of their daughter, and they'll talk about some concern about the performance of their son. This is a deep entrenched pattern. So why is it? Well, that's Josh Hawley's thesis. The position taken by Richard Reeves, which I'm sympathetic to, is he does concede that biology is an issue. He does think that we can't just ignore the data. Men do take more risks. Men do appear to have a higher sex drive, and men are more aggressive. And part of the problem we're having in navigating how to handle men in society is that we're reluctant to recognize that core biological, and you don't want to generalize that. There are plenty of women who have a high sex drive. There are plenty of women who are inclined to take risks, and there are plenty of women who can be aggressive. But if you look on balance about percentages, you'll find it's more true of the male and less true of the woman. It's interesting. The most frustrating thing about this book, partly because he didn't want to go down the Josh Hawley route, is his prescription solutions are pretty limited. So, for example, one of them is boys need an extra year at home before going to school. We need more male teachers. And he also thinks we need more technical high schools and linked to that technical vocations in colleges. So more professions like being an electrician or a painter, and a proper training with a focus on that being the goal. My sense is that a lot of this is sort of tinkering at the edge. So I think the reason why this is quite an interesting topic for the church is you have Josh Hawley's solution, which is basically an anti-feminist message, and then you have Richard Reeves, which is almost a technocratic set of solutions. And of course, the problem with some of them is requiring a child to be at home for an additional year is, of course, really difficult if there are socioeconomic complexities and the parents need to be working. So, some of his own data makes that as a solution difficult to be implemented. So, what's this got to do with church? Well, before we come to church, let me just touch on one of the most disturbing statistics that we're now having to face up to, and that is suicide by men. Men are both more likely to attempt suicide and more likely to succeed. That's partly because men are more likely to acquire a firearm to bring about the deed. One of the interesting things, and I sort of think often neglected questions around the debate around guns, is actually the vast majority of deaths aren't the mass shootings. They are domestic, and it's either accidents or temper, or suicide. And of course, the thing about a gun, if you leap off the top of a bridge or something, there's a possibility you might survive. But the thing about a gun is there's a high likelihood you'll succeed. Men are dying of suicide at 4 times the rate of women. So what I'm trying to suggest is this is important data for us to be aware of as Christians. And I also think it's important data for us to sit with and think a little bit about what's the explanation for these trends and how can the church best respond to them. So let's turn to men in the church. It was Putnam's famous classic book entitled Bowling Alone that actually diagnosed a deep challenge facing any voluntary organization in the United States. Because of a whole host of factors, the book came out in the 1980s, and it was both documenting a trajectory that's just increased ever since. And what Putnam drew attention to is that voluntary organizations are very fragile. Now, voluntary organizations include everything: churches, Freemasonry, the Brotherhood, and so the list goes, Lions. I mean, all these organizations, which before the Second World War were strong and robust, and that continued after the war in the 50s and 60s, and they continue to be a very important part. People joined things. They belong, they participate in its governance, they gave to support it. And in fact, the whole of church is built on an assumption that voluntary organizations is the way to go, and that we need to, that is the primary vehicle for dissemination of the gospel, is a voluntary organization called a congregation. What's changed, and it's partly urban life, it's partly secularization, it's partly the sheer array of self-made entertainment you can have from the streaming service through to online games. What's changed is people now are not really interested in joining organizations. What they prefer to do is buy a service. So you'll go to a restaurant, you sit and have a meal. You don't feel any obligation to run the restaurant. You don't feel any obligation to give to the restaurant. All you do is you contract with them for a meal and you pay for the meal. And that's the deal. And people like that model. So people still go to things. They go to the theater, although less than they did. They go to movie theaters. They go to escape rooms. People still go to things. But the model in every case is you walk through a door and contract with the organization for a service. One of the ironies of the controversy that the Washington National Cathedral got embroiled in, where they had the temerity to charge $8 to go to a Christmas Eve service, although technically it was a booking fee, but they didn't have a booking fee for anything else, was in a weird sort of way. That's, people get that. They sort of go, yeah, I want great music and good preaching, and it's Christmas Eve, and I'm willing to pay $8. It was potentially, it would have been a contract that people would have understood, although you'll know that there was a huge social media outburst and the cathedral relented and changed its mind. Okay, so the place to begin as we think about these things is voluntary organizations are fragile anyway. In addition, men are less likely to belong to them. So that's what you see in this slide here. The general stats are basically 60-40. Has been a pretty settled statistic now for a long time. And I'll show you a slide in a moment about how this has not been an issue just recently. It goes back literally centuries. But do notice how there is evidence, and this is the scary bit, because of the fragile nature of voluntary organizations, everybody stopped going to church. So I'll quote from Christianity Today, summarizing survey data. There looks like it might be a generational shift where women become as irreligious as men. The religion-gender gap has persisted among older Americans. Survey data from October 2021 found that among those born in 1950, about a quarter of men identified as atheists, agnostic, or nothing in particular, compared to just 20% of women of the same age. That's same 5-point gap is evident among those born in the 1960s and 1970s as well. For millennials and Generation Z, it's a different story. Among those born in 1980, the gap begins to narrow to with about 2 percentage points. And by 1990, the gap disappears with those born in 2000 or later. Women are clearly more likely to be nuns than men. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is just make the picture quite complicated here. And there are 3 trajectories we're handling. The first trajectory is there's a crisis around being male in America today. The second trajectory is that just at the minute, women are outnumbering men in terms of their participation in congregations. And then the third trajectory is the bowling alone hypothesis of Putnam and increasing secularization and the growth of the nuns, the NONES, is potentially leading to the fragile nature of congregations, which means there'll be an increasing minority who are present in congregations. Okay, with all that data, let's think a little bit about what's the way forward. And I love this. So this is a book which Tom can read because he has access. In fact, any alum of Virginia Theological Seminary can read. So Bishop, if you want to track it down, feel free. And I think it's great because here it is, 1860. And you have this, the Reverend Philip Slaughter, who is in Culpeper County, Virginia, the rector of Calvary Church. And man and woman, or the law of honor applied to the solution of the problem, why are so many more women than men Christians? So that's that. Like, remember, there's nothing new under the sun, said King Solomon. It's sort of reassuring that we're not thinking about a new question. It goes back literally centuries. So that's good. You'll see from his chapter headings, he's got quite an idiosyncratic approach to it all. He considers all the obvious explanations. Men are more sinful. Men are more likely to be depraved. He's great. Sort of explanations we're not into as Episcopalians. Okay, so I'm going to suggest a couple of constructive strategies, but before I come to this, and basically it's got 5 components, of which this is the most important, participation. But before I come there, I just want to say, in the debate in the academy today about the future of church, a key issue is how important it is we continue to be in the business of sustaining voluntary organizations. So in other words, you get some voices. Bishop Andy Doyle, in certain moods, is one of them. The director of our tri-tank here out of Virginia Theological Seminary, Lorenzo Laprija, is another, who would say, look, we're just going to have to get over the fact that people aren't necessarily going to join the church as traditionally understood. And church has got to evolve into meeting people where they are. And that can be a workplace Bible study. That can be an internet experience, a virtual church where you put on your goggles and you imagine you're in a congregation and you even sit down and you sing hymns and that's going to be the future. It's going to have to be tailor-made for each individual. And it might end up being more of a service, not in the traditional sense, but, more analogous going to a restaurant. You make a payment and then you get provided a spirituality podcast that you can use when you're running and think about your prayer life and who you are as a child of God and your relationship with Christ. Okay, and then you've got the other half who say, no, yeah, sure, voluntary associations are in trouble, but there are lots of reasons to do everything we can to arrest that and ideally try and push back against it. And the argument for the latter position is that church is really good for you. Since 1996, there have been something like 250, 300 different studies by reputable sociologists and medical practitioners. And one can just repeated finding is going to church regularly is just really good for your life. In 1996, a very pivotal study, because it was so large and it was a longitudinal study, established that if you can persuade a 25-year-old to go to church at least twice a week, so that means go on Sundays and an event during the week, go to a Bible study, join the choir, join an outreach ministry, it doesn't matter what, but twice a week, they will outlive their secular friends by 7 years. And even if you can't imagine that little extra act in the middle of the week, you outlive your secular neighbor by at least 2. There was a big study of nurses in 2016, which came out of Harvard University. And this was a huge study. I mean, it was one of the biggest and most expensive studies that had ever been done on a whole host of life-related factors. And nurses are interesting because there's a socioeconomic similarity. So this was a very important study because so many people just said, look, if you are a sort of person who goes to church, it's not surprising you live longer because you're less likely to smoke pot or get hooked on drugs or, do dangerous sports or, drink to excess. So therefore, of course, it's not surprising you live longer. The great thing about taking just nurses, a profession, was that you had people who were socioeconomically very similar and also doing similar work every day. So any differences here would be really interesting. Even with nurses, you found a 3-year difference in terms of longevity. And backing down, if you look at the micro level of blood pressure, cholesterol levels, all these health markers that you have tested every single time you go to do your physical, again, repeatedly, people who regularly attend church have better health indicators than people who don't. So it's really interesting. And I think this does speak to why. And the interesting thing is that attendance is the key. So you can be a fundamentalist Christian or you can be a devout Roman Catholic, but if you spend Sundays on the golf course, you don't get the health benefits. It's actually going, driving in your car, getting out, walking in, sitting and being bored, walking out, getting back into your car. That is what is essential for your health. So let me put this argument with Richard Reeves. I'm trying to make the case that there's a link here, that actually part of the reason why women are outperforming men is because they're more likely to be involved in a voluntary organization called the church. They're more likely to be present. And because men are absent, that's creating a real problem. Okay, now park that thought. Let's return to what can be done about it. And here is one of the, Adair Loomis is actually a very good researcher. She's also an Episcopalian. And this 2004, they call it a research note, but it's a pretty substantial research note, actually stresses something which I do think is pivotal. One of the most important habits leadership of congregations has got to get into is when anybody walks in, try and find a way of getting them to participate in some form. Participate, join the brotherhood, join a Bible study, join an outreach ministry, it doesn't matter, join the choir, join something. Early on, data from the 2002 survey of 2,200 laypersons who are at least titular members of Episcopal congregations located in different regions of the United States are used to explore why men are not as involved in church life as some may want. Survey results indicate that the presence of women in ordained or in lay church leadership does not significantly diminish men's feelings of being appreciated by their congregations. That's important because that pushes back against the Josh Hawley thesis. Rather, both laymen and women feel more value for their church participation. They're currently involved in a variety of parish activities, and if they were elected to the church governing board. Young men, however, feel more appreciated than older men, even if they do relatively little in church, while women's age is unrelated to their sense of being valued for their participation. Participation is crucial. So, 4 more suggestions. Get the male participating in some way or form in the life of the congregation. Now, there are 4 difficulties, the 4 other suggestions. If I said to you all, this Friday, I would like you to go to Jummah, I would like you to go to Muslim prayers. I'll send you, just Google your local mosque and go along. Now, I just want you to pause and listen to your head for a second. And I bet you're all thinking, I couldn't possibly do that. So why not? Well, we're not sure where to go, but of course we can't solve that with a GPS and a Google Maps. We're not sure whether we would behave in the right ways once we were there. We certainly wouldn't want to go alone. You know, we're sort of, what you're feeling now is what a secular friend of yours feels. If ever they have the moment when they think, perhaps I should go to church. It's this bigger gap. To get you to go to a mosque is how most secular people feel about church. So you've got to feel that aversion. You've got to feel like, so one thing I'm trying to, I've suggested to when I do dios and conventions and things like that, is I think it'd be great if a church website head, click here if you would like a buddy to meet you at a local coffee shop and bring you to church. You know, now you'll get a high number of people who click and don't turn up. A bit like dating, you know. But you'll get some who will click and will turn up. And then, of course, the great thing about it, so if I said to you, I've got a Muslim friend of mine, and he would love to take you to a mosque because he wants you to get a sense of what they do and they're not frightening and the people are nice, I'm sure you then go, oh, yeah, I can do that. In fact, it'd be interesting. I've never been before. I would love to know what they do. So that's getting through the door. People don't appreciate just how difficult it is to go through the door. And the sense of, you know, the Episcopal Church welcomes you does not do it. Does not do it. And it's true, once you're inside our churches, because we're Episcopalians, it's actually quite complicated. You know, it's easy to misstep. And I've been doing this stuff for decades. But, you know, it's pretty easy to misstep. You can easily end up by inadvertently, you know, sitting when you should be standing. Or we're doing Rite One in chapel just at the minute. And, you know, last 3 times I've been in there, I've said, and also with you, fortunately, the rest of the congregation drowns me out. But, you know, so it's easy to, and finding S in the hymnal, where is S in the hymnal? You've got no chance. And you've got to juggle at least 2 books. I mean, you know, it's always hard. So a buddy who can teach you how to navigate it. And then I do think that congregations should start recognizing, in the same sense as women groups were formed, to support women as they navigated the world of patriarchy. And in a funny sort of way, I think men groups are needed. And it's not we're up against a matriarchy, because that's not what's happening at all. It is that we're unable to realize our potential. And because the world is competitive, we're falling behind in terms of what we can give as a gender. So I think offering services for men that men need, educational support, employment advice, a dating service. I'm a big fan of the programs where people help high schoolers read and, you know, and perhaps do maths, and the sort of mentoring programming that congregations are participating in. I think they're huge and I think they're important. I think marriage preparation should prepare the male for seasons of unemployment and learning less than women. So I think there needs to be a much greater socioeconomic awareness of the complexity of living and life. And then finally, the brotherhood was founded in the 19th century. But brotherhood is more needed now in the 21st than it was then. Because what you provide is people walking the journey with you, networks of friendship, grounded in faith. And therefore, you know, every congregation needs a branch, because that is exactly what can make a difference to the data and the surveys that you find now being documented by people like Richard. So that's the pitch on to. Let me just summarize, and then I'll happily take in questions. So the argument's gone in you know, sections really. Section 1 was we're facing the crisis of the male, and my sympathies are more with Richard Reeves than they are with Josh Worley. So in other words, I don't blame feminism. I think feminism was a necessary antidote to the evil of patriarchy, and therefore, you know, it's important and right, and there's still hurdles to overcome. It's not like the cause is finished. There's still an issue around the pay, the salary the salary gap and the glass ceiling. But there is also a crisis of the male that needs to be confronted. And if it isn't confronted soon, you know, if we get decades of this, I mean, whatever you think of certain popularist movements in America today and the attractions of political extremes, a component of it is undoubtedly the disaffected male. That is a component. Okay, so that's section one. Section two is there's a debate in the church about voluntary organizations. You know, should we be putting all our energy in supporting a gathered group of people who occupy a building on a Sunday morning? And I'm sympathetic to the debate and those who argue for alternatives. And I think there's wisdom and possibility there, but I still think the voluntary unit, the congregation, remains important. Step three is, I think you make sense of part of the reason why women function better than men is because they're still tapped into those voluntary organizations and therefore have networks of support and are engaging with the spiritual and reflecting on their lives and locating their problems. So that's a factor in their success. And then stage five is, how do we attract men? Participation's key. And then, you know, I think the male buddy to get them through the door. And then finally, let's rethink some of the services we provide for men in congregations, including developing more branches of the brotherhood. Okay, I'll happily take any questions, thoughts, observations, criticisms, disagreements. And I see a hand. I see Conrad's.
All right. Thank you, Dean. Yes, sir. Conrad?
Yes, thank you so much. That was so well prepared and delivered. Thank you. I am going to ask your permission to steal one of your quotes that you just gave a few minutes ago about a network of friendship grounded in faith. I love that saying. We could build on that, I think, a lot in our messaging that we are trying to message to those that don't know about the brotherhood yet. And I think it speaks volumes in those 6 words. The slide that you had in the study that was done about the generational every 10 years, the gap narrowing, I wasn't clear. Was that gap narrowing because there were more women were becoming unassociated with the church, or more men were becoming associated, so they were coming down to where the women were, or the women were coming up to where the men were and above? Which was the way it proceeded that way?
Sadly, it's because women are becoming as irreligious, in fact, more irreligious than men. So as a result, the congregations are all getting smaller, or at least older. I mean, the impact on membership is still opaque, but the young Gen Z are not joining congregations because they're more likely to be indifferent or secular, and that's more true of women than men. Therefore, paradoxically, we might end up with a situation where the gap between men and women disappears, but that's only because there are fewer people going, and that women are more inclined to be skeptical than men and non-participatory. So it is. So this is where the whole thing's complicated. It all melds together a whole host of trends. Secularization's in there, the bowling alone, Putnam hypothesis, people don't want to join voluntary organizations anymore. And then layer on top of all that, the crisis of the male, you know, you have a mesh of problems functioning. And one challenge for us is to fight on many fronts, to use a metaphor, which I absolutely.
Is that true across Episcopal, Catholic, Methodist, Lutheran, it does not matter really. It's just, or the study was specific to
No, it's
Christian
true.
behavior.
The challenge of Gen Z, and to a lesser extent millennials, is shared across all denominations. Now, some denominations, there's a very interesting study by Robert George. No, that's not his name. It'll come to me in a minute. He runs PRRI. And what he documents is the dramatic decline of Southern Baptists. Now, they're in trouble because not only do we all have the problem that Gen Z are flirting with being disaffiliated or uninterested, the problem Southern Baptists have got is that anybody under the age of 40 has a problem with President Trump, sort of crudely. In other words, they worry about a tradition that's not LGBT plus friendly, or not worried about the environment, or, you know, so that's an issue. They've got to, so is this reassuring or depressing? Depressing, I suppose. Everybody's got a problem. Some denominations have got more problems than we have. Yes.
Okay.
And,
Good
yeah,
enough.
and one of the things I've heard this semester here on campus at VTS, and actually I've seen, is about 2/3 of my freshman class are female. Most of them are most all of us here as students are under 40, and every one of them are absolutely crazy about Jesus, or they would not be here. So when I'm looking at these bright young minds who could be doing 100 other things, and some struggling to balance everything out, I'm encouraged by what I see happening here at VTS. And when I have a friend like Stephen Schreier join us tonight, we're in a theological writing class together, and you can just see there's a spirit in the students here, and the faculty are so engaged and open to being available to us. Jeff Butcher, I see you have a question. You need to unmute.
I love this, sir. I just absolutely love this. The one question that I would like to pose to you is that we're hearing stories about new priests coming in and doing away with gender-specific organizations and wanting to have everything commingled, and don't like the idea of a male group having their own Bible study. How do we combat that?
Right. So the data shows that that's unwise. The data also shows that in almost every area, affinity groups are helpful. Now, why is that? Well, it's because in a highly mixed group, you will find that people are nervous about expressing their deepest concerns, fears, anxieties, hopes, and aspirations. And that's just, and therefore, you know, feminism grew partly because women started gathering together. Certainly African Americans and students of color, we have a Students of Color Union on the campus. They have regular meetings for the membership of the society. We have PRISM, which is our LGBT plus community. They have regular meetings where they come together. You know, it is just actually best practice to create spaces. Where it becomes problematic is if you exclude some people from gathering. Right, that's wrong. So it's not good if the only organization available is a male-only society and nobody else is allowed a female or a. But sure, create plenty of opportunities for people to commingle. Definitely, Sunday mornings, especially, you know, choir, Bible studies, whatever. There should be plenty of opportunities for people to commingle. But you also need to allow space for a group together, which is a shared, in this particular case, men, but it could be women, it could be male persons of color. I mean, you know, but it is just good. And in those settings, conversations are possible that are not possible if every setting is a commingled setting. You know, and when you think about your own life, you know, I have different conversations with my siblings when it's just the sibling and me. But when we both got our partners or spouses with us, the conversations are different. And that's for a whole host of reasons, you know. And it's just, you know, when you were a kid, conversations were different when there was an adult in the room.
Right.
And therefore it's good for just occasionally kids to be together. You know, when you think about the logic of this is one of the most... Now, where it becomes sinister is if it becomes a safe space to be racist or to be homophobic or to be prejudiced against women, right? That's when it becomes sinister. But on the understanding, the affinity group being formed is not seeking to do that. It's seeking to be simply people who can say, look, I wouldn't be able to say this to my wife, but I've had suicidal thoughts over the last month. And to be able to say that to other men who are statistically more likely to understand and empathize with that experience, right, is hugely important. So yeah, just send any clergy person who decides they don't want a branch of the brotherhood in their congregation to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got time for one more question tonight, brothers, maybe two. Any others that pops in mind? I want to extend a special welcome to a guest we've had from outside of the Brotherhood this evening. I see my friend Gerald Ball from Trinity Wall Street came down to visit with us via Zoom tonight. Got a great group of the men of Trinity, the Trinity men group there. I think you all can begin to see part of the excitement I have for what's happening in the church today from the enthusiasm that we see in our dean here at VTS. Any other questions this evening for us? We try to give it a hard stop about 9 o'clock. Any closing words of encouragement or things along those natures, Dean Markham, before we hand it back off to Conrad to bless us out of here?
Well, let me just take this opportunity to thank Tom for being Tom. It's been great to have him as a student on the campus. He has lived fully into the life of a seminarian. He said, you know, he's utterly and totally, to reassure the board or membership, he's utterly present at worship. We require one corporate act of worship a day, and Tom is... We all tend to gravitate. Isn't it weird how we all gravitate to the same sort of seats? I've never really understood that. The second thing about Tom is that he really has been a seasoning, in to use the biblical image. You know, there is a joy in a maturity that navigates a student body. And those of you who remember being a seminarian, how so often you feel as if the world is falling apart, and just occasionally somebody who's just a little older, and I'm not going to cast aspersions on Tom's age, but it does have that gift of perspective where you simply say, well, hang on, you know, perhaps it isn't really completely falling apart, it's just slightly precarious. And that's a huge gift. But I assume there's a question in the chat that the recording will be available.
Yeah, we will, within 48 hours, typically we'll have the recording here uploaded to a YouTube link. We'll post it on our website under our webinars section, and it'll be a YouTube link so you can play it at any other gathering, meeting, whatever you might like to use it for. So we've had many times we'll have chapters that will have a meeting, their chapter meeting, and listen to the webinar from the week before. So it will be available within 48 hours.
That's good. And
Well, thank you all.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, my
Go
last
ahead, Dean
sentence,
Markham.
if I
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
just one last sentence, and that is that, Christmas reading, ask your loved one, of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, is, I think, a text that the Brotherhood especially should engage with, because I think this is the business you're in. And it's an important business. I'm utterly and totally persuaded of the importance of the work that you're doing.
Brothers, I want to
Thank
give
you so
you
much.
give you Advent blessings. And Conrad, you'll close us out.
Yes, sir. Thank you all again for joining. I really appreciate it. For our guests who have joined us, we hope you'll come back to hear more of our webinars. We're always on the first Wednesday night of the month at 8 p.m. And we have hosted webinars on many, many topics that are particularly interesting to today's man. And I hope you, that same place on our website, you can review any of our previous webinars, and the topics are easily listed. So I encourage you to do that. So with that, I'll say the Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you again for a wonderful day. We live in your paradise. Thank you for all the gifts that you pour upon us every day. The gift that you've given us tonight in our speaker, who is helping us to understand more about the role of men in our church and what we can do as a brotherhood to reach out to men more and help them walk through that door, whether it's with a buddy or an invitation. It's up to us to, in our evangelistic efforts, to reach out to those men and bring them in. We ask your blessings on our families as we go into the night. Please bring peace to the world. We have so much chaos that we can only find our grounding and our peace and security by coming to you and being closer to you. Dear Lord, bless us all, bless the brotherhood, and bless all that are on our meeting tonight. We ask all of this in Christ's blessed name. Amen.
Amen.
Happy Advent, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Blessings, brothers. Share the story.